All right, so it's the 13th episode, and I think it's appropriate to talk about this next band for my 13th episode. And what I'm going to do is roll things back to basics, get back to the bread and butter, wax tracks, and the Chicago industrial music scene. So there were just a few bands that were central to the Wax Trax family back in the day. Ministry was obviously at the center of that. Wax Trax itself was pretty much Jim Nash and Danny Flesher, with Al Jorgensen subsidizing the whole thing. But there were a few other key individuals. In reading all the memoirs and liner notes and watching the documentaries, one name kept coming up: Frank Nardiello. He was the lead singer of Special Effect, which was a Chicago band that featured pre-Ministry Al Jorgensen on guitar. He's credited for doing lights on the Revolting Cocks live album, You Goddamn Son of a Bitch. And in time, he would meet a like-minded co-conspirator, a man named Marston Daly, who is also interested in music and film. And Marston Daly may or may not be of the famous Chicago Dalys, a family which produced two mayors named Richard. I've never heard that discussed before, so curious about that. Regardless, far from entering city politics, these two hatched a plan to make a low-budget horror film, and they were going to call it Hammerhead Housewife and the Thrill Kill Cult. That movie never got made, but they did record a bit of the soundtrack, and Wax Trax put it out as a vinyl-only EP. And, of course, the band name on that EP was, as we know, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, which children everywhere would soon refer to as just TKK. Frank and Marston themselves were transformed into their alter egos, Groovy Man and Buzz McCoy. That was back in 1987. And since then, they'd go on to blaze a trail for industrial, sleazy, satanic lounge disco, inspiring later acts like the Electric Hellfire Club, the Lords of Acid, Sheep on Drugs, Marilyn Manson, White Zombie, and Erasure. Just kidding there about White Zombie. Anyway, there were so many copycats that I could browse the industrial, sleazy, satanic lounge disco section at Borders at one point in time, which happened to be right next to 100 feet of shelving marked New Teen Paranormal Romance. Okay, so anyway, when did I first hear TKK? It was probably the EP 'Cause It's Hot. And I think I probably heard this in 1990. My friend had this CD and probably put it on to impress the rest of us. And, we were duly impressed. The full title of this song was A Girl Doesn't Get Killed by Her Make-Believe Lover 'Cause It's Hot, which I guess didn't fit on the side of the CD case. But what it was 10 minutes of this infectious disco beat with absurd horror movie samples and vocals that sounded like they were coming down a crackly telephone line. And it was mindless, it was catchy, it was offensive to the right demographics, so naturally, we all loved it. But the B-side was even better. It was as dark as the first song was upbeat, and it was a light-hearted little number called A Daisy Chain for Satan. And it started off with this hypnotic beat and samples of this hippie chick professing her love for drugs. That led to what I can only describe as groovy screaming melodically. I mean, just that far we were in. We were totally in. It had only been 15 seconds, and this track was already way cooler than anything else we had ever heard. Then the bass line started, and our heads exploded. It was this super simple bass line, but the way it drove the track and fit into the rest of the music was just amazing. And it would be a long time before any of us who picked up guitars would play anything other than that bass line. It was just killer. And you add in the really minor key keyboard sounds and the semi-drunken lyrics and the funky breakdown in the middle, and we were all in love with this track. I probably wore out several tapes by just rewinding that track and playing it over and over and over. So yes, this single was our entree into TKK. And just a side note, I love this cover. Looking at it, it's not immediately clear what it is, but it's a picture of a daisy inside the flames from a gas stove burner. So I guess the flames are for track A because it's hot, and the daisy is for track B, a daisy chain for Satan. And complete side note, I learned that this picture of the daisy was actually taken from a vinyl record of the actual interview with the hippie girl who was sampled for the track, which WNEW released in 1967. So there is a little bit of a connection there. So this was the first taste of TKK that we had back in the day. The second bit was this little number, the Cooler Than Jesus EP. By now we had seen the epic video for their song Cooler Than Jesus. The name alone made it a guaranteed hit with us. Remember, this was just a mere 20 years after the Bible thumpers had pilloried John Lennon for saying the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. Not only was TKK saying they were cooler, but they misspelled it with a K. Okay, what could possibly be more provoking than that? Anyway, we love the track Cooler Than Jesus. It was just as kickin' as 'Cause It's Hot, but it also had awesome samples of a guy yelling, "I am the Electric Messiah, the AC/DC God," which made no sense really, but it sounded cool and also sounded vaguely inappropriate. So we were on board. Let's look at the tracks on this. They're all special in their way, but track 2 would really be a special favorite. Not only was it called Devil Bunnies, which was hilarious, but it had this ridiculously bouncy beat and this absurd car racing theme with some truly great samples on it. We thought track 3 was called Nervous X-Ians until someone older and wiser than us hipped us that the X meant Christ, sort of like Xmas means Christmas. So I guess this title is Nervous Christians, which is fair enough given the content. It was more of the same, but featured this wonderful sample at the beginning. Reality is the only word in the English language that should always be used in quotes. Although I would add liberty and justice to that. But this song would get reworked in a few years for the soundtrack to The Crow, which was overall a pretty terrible early superhero movie that's unfortunately mostly known for the accidental death of its star, Brandon Lee. But the soundtrack was really good for it, and it had a Nine Inch Nails cover of Joy Division's Dead Souls, and it had TKK reworking this track, Nervous Christians, and they renamed it to After the Flesh. And I believe they appeared actually in the movie performing that song. The soundtrack was pretty successful, and it pushed TKK to a new level of notoriety in the U.S. The next two tracks are really the same song, just in different versions, and they appeared on various releases as First Cut and This Is What the Devil Does and The Devil Does Drugs. This tune, in whatever form, had the obligatory Fairlight orchestral hit that was common to most early industrial dance, and also features the band name-checking themselves very much in the manner of KMFDM. The last two tracks on here, The Shock of Point 6 and Resisting the Spirit, are slower, darker, no disco here, just evil ambiance. So yeah, this is the Cooler Than Jesus EP, and it's really a CD compilation of 3 vinyl releases. So the first 2 tracks were on the Cooler Than Jesus vinyl 12-inch. The next 2 were from the 12-inch vinyl Some Have to Dance, Some Have to Kill. And the last 3 were from their very first release, the self-titled My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult 12-inch. So presumably those tracks were meant for their film soundtrack. And it's interesting to me that the song First Cut was indeed their first cut because it was the first song on their first release. So makes sense. Anyway, back in 1990, we found all of this suitably fun and hilarious, and it was common for us to blast Cooler Than Jesus out the car windows, hoping some adult would hear it and do a double take. Of course, None of them did. No one really cared. Okay, so who were the TKK? So first, you have to admire the guts of any band in the 80s who put cult right there in their name, even if it was misspelled. Remember, this was back in the days of the Parents Musical Resource Center, or the PMRC. So the government was coming after any band they thought represented a threat to decent society. And sure enough, the PMRC took the bait here, and they cited some TKK lyrics as an example of evil indoctrination. Of course, we kids used the PMRC much like we used the band reading list. It was a list of things we wanted to check out. So, I mean, there wasn't much point in us following bands that didn't represent some kind of social danger. We were teenagers, right? Anyway, it soon became clear that the band was essentially these two core individuals. It was Groovy Man and Buzz McCoy with a bunch of other musicians and singers who kind of floated in and out. They had a group of all-female backup singers who were dubbed the Bomb Gang Girls, and everyone in the band had a silly pseudonym. So we had Buck Ryder, Jackie Black, Kitty Kildare, Rhonda Bond, Cherry Blue, and so on and on and on. Members came and went, but Groovy and Buzz remained the core of the band. So were they really Satanists and murderers or a cult? Of course not. It was clear to us, because we had brains in our heads, that it was all an act. They were a party band. There were real cults of a sort in the popular music scene of the time, but TKK was not one of them. They were just making really cool industrial dance music. For cults that were real, you might want to check out the Process Church of the Final Judgment, or even the Temple of Psychic Youth, TPOV. We were aware of these as kids, but neither had any impact on us. Why? Because, again, we weren't morons. Unlike some adults, we could easily distinguish provocative entertainment from worse things. So, of course, you know how it goes. Kids dabble in things, and sometimes it's a slippery slope. In our case, someone finally picked up their full-length album, Confessions of a Knife. And oddly, this is their second album, but it's the first one that we really got into. Their first album was called I See Good Spirits and I See Bad Spirits. But somehow we didn't get that until like a year or so later, probably 91 and 92. So Confessions of a Knife would leave a much bigger impression on all of us. And I'm saying we and us here, and not just I or me, because around this time something funny started happening. My group of friends was pretty tight, still is, and when we went to college, we stayed that way, at least for the first year or so, before sort of going our separate ways, thanks to all of us getting on this thing called the internet. So remember, this was in the dark days of the internet, before web browsers. It was all email and Usenet groups and FTP sites and Telnet. And you had to be willing to learn some command line stuff if you wanted to communicate with your friends. But we were all pretty smart and motivated, so that's what we did. And we stayed in touch despite living in a bunch of different cities. And weirdly, TKK became a key that unlocked a strange shared sense of humor. So the emails we exchanged became these writing exercises in morbid humor and inside jokes and wordplay. And the whole bunch of us, a few dozen kids probably across 3 or 4 college campuses, girls and boys, were chatting with each other nearly daily, kind of like early social media. And for some reason, my friends and I had started using Pig Latin. And you might be familiar with this. It's a kid's way of talking that lightly changes the words. So you put the first sound of the word at the end and add A at the end. So cult becomes alt-K. Why was this funny? You could argue that it wasn't, but what was a little bit funny was this idea to apply it to longer strings of words, like especially a long swear word. So for instance, son of a bitch became un of a bitch say. So the meaning was still perfectly clear. And if anything, using Pig Latin just drew attention to it. And we just, I don't know, we were young and silly and we thought that was hilarious. Who knows why? And one thing led to another, and we were just doing this all the time and doing it with our friends through email. And since we were all listening to TKK on heavy rotation, we mixed in a bit of this silly evilness into it. And so someone, I don't remember who exactly, invented Doom Latin, which was like Pig Latin, but you added at the end instead of a. And remember, this was well before the id Software Doom game became popular, 2 or 3 years before. So we did it first. Anyway, the word doom in Doom Latin became doom, which we thought sounded hilarious. And looking at all of this now, it's clear what was going on. We didn't have a word for it then, but now we would say we were inventing memes before anyone was really using the word in that way. And just to clarify for the record, the term meme had been around for much longer than silly things on the internet, because Richard Dawkins coined it in 1976 in his book, The Selfish Gene. So it has had a meaning in evolutionary biology for decades, right? Long before anyone was using it in terms of lolcats. But we were participating here in this kind of shared behavior, and each person was sort of influencing and evolving this as it happened. And it was interesting to see there in the early internet. So we got into more wordplay, and someone noticed that mood of doom was a great palindrome, so that became a thing. Like you'd say, I'm in a mood of doom after that calc test, man. And then we graduated to longer, silly sayings like the raw sewage flume spells sure doom for you. That was something that a friend of mine came up with. And, it was just something to put in an email to scratch your head over. And every day was like this absurd Monty Python-like creative writing contest. And I still have a lot of these emails, and it's still pretty funny to read them 30 or so years later. I think things reached a weird extreme when someone came up with something they called armadillo Latin, where you added igamsmuff to the end of the word. And that was really nuts, and I guess that was the point. But I also remember that there was one girl who was more into all of this than most of us, and really was pushing things and started collecting knives and sleeping with them under her pillow. All in good fun, of course, just all in good fun. But anyway, in my opinion, I think our crowning achievement was when this one guy joined the group, and he was at a different college than me with some of my high school friends. And he sent me an email saying something like, I just wanted to say that your friend's humor and weird way of talking have steeped into my dreams. And he proceeded to describe a dream about getting chased by Gumby, the TV character, and then having to fight Gumby with a knife, all while talking in his sleep, while his roommate was carefully writing all this down. So that was maybe the high point of our memes at that point. But another kind of strange thing was when I actually visited that school at some point during the year, and I was surrounded by a bunch of people who were all into this. And first of all, they looked at me like a curiosity, maybe blaming me for what was going on. Like, is this the weirdo that started all this? And to be clear, it wasn't just me, but it was maybe me with, a half dozen other people. But we all had this like shared vocabulary and humor, and in a way it was great. And nowadays this happens all the time because you have people from all over the world who are communicating on social media, on Reddit, on Twitter, or whatever, and everybody in the world gets the joke. But 30 years ago, we were just sort of experiencing that in a much smaller way, and weirdly enough, TKK was a part of that. So yeah, that's all very much bound into my feelings for this record. But I should also clarify here that we were all good kids, objectively. None of us took the occult stuff seriously. Again, we were too smart for that. And ditto the fake Satanism. We understood that it was an act. Was any of this kind of activity fueled by college substance experimentation? I can say not on my part. I can't speak for anyone else. Some of those emails were pretty out there. And as South Park wisely said, there's a time and place for everything, and it's called college. But as far as I know, everyone graduated and went on to be an upstanding member of American middle-class society. Anyway, as I said, TKK was central to all this because they epitomized this sort of fake occult absurd silliness. And not only that, but At their core, they were a party band, and who likes to party more than college kids? Answer, no one. So yeah, we were all on board with TKK. And I, for one, would do my part in infecting my younger friends with TKK. I ended up going to school nearby my hometown in my freshman year, so I still hung out with some of the kids in the high school. They all got into this. They made copies of this record, Confessions of a Knife. In fact, one friend borrowed my tape, and I wouldn't get it back from her until many years later. I don't think she even wanted to return it. She really was into it. That whole episode ended more or less in our sophomore years. We ended up digging into our majors and more or less lost touch and generally grew up. But anyway, let's talk about Confessions of a Knife. We're here to talk about this crazy album after all. Let's dig into it. This was released on Wax Trax, of course, which to us was like a pre-approval that we were going to like it. Looking at the artwork, I think it's suitably freaky. There's a gravestone that says boys in front of some barbed wire or some sort of fence. The back has much the same, but the stone says girls. So already, just looking at these two covers, we've got religion, sex, and pain. That about sums it up. Not much here in the way of liner notes, which was pretty typical of Wax Trax, just, an ad for the mailing lists. Awesome design on the CD, though. This Who, Why, Murdered here looks like some graffiti maybe on a train car. That's a lyric in one of the songs, Burning Dirt, so that's funny. Just throw this back in here, and let's just talk about it track by track. So you get a lot of value on this CD because it has 11 songs on it. Some were remixes of previously released songs, but nevertheless were, pretty good remixes. So this kind of acted as a best of as well as a new studio album. But it starts off really strongly with a version of A Daisy Chained for Satan, the Acid and Flowers mix. I find that this version is very slightly slowed down from the original on 'Cause It's Hot. And it's almost mixed to be a little more bass heavy. It's still a great song, not much difference here, though this version lacks my favorite part, which is this cool kill switch effect that happens near the end of the original at one point. We would all just sit there and wait for it, and then go crazy. So, yeah, anyway, it achieves the goal here of being a really good opening song for the whole album. That goes into their signature tune, The Days of Swine and Roses. This is a classic TKK track. What's not to like with the Bomb Gang girls chanting Christian zombie vampires over and over? TKK would do a split single with KMFDM that featured a KMFDM remix of this on one side and the TKK remix of KMFDM's Naive on the other. Track 3 is Hand in Hand, which is a slower, kind of more ominous track. Has some cool rock guitar on it. It's nice to mix things up and give it a more kind of a heavier tone. Then we go into Waiting for Mommy. This is just a completely silly track. Sort of like if Joan Crawford was in a cage match on RuPaul's Drag Race. That should give you an idea. It gives the Bomb Gang girls the lead vocals, and the best I can say is it's arguably empowering for women. So there you go. That's the Bomb Gang girls track on this record. That goes into Confessions of a Knife theme part 1. This is just a slower track with lots of spooky horror samples. Leads into Ride the Mind Way, another signature tune of theirs, always goes over well in concert. It's got this awesome program funk bass line. So we had Waiting for Mommy, and this song has the Bomb Gang girls chanting Go Daddy Go. So there you go. That's good. We've got both parents covered here. This is a very family-oriented album. That leads into Rivers of Blood, Years of Darkness. This is kind of a down-tempo tune, but it's super groovy and funky. It has this really distinctive warbly guitar sample, and I later figured out what that was from. I was sitting in a friend's kitchen one night, and the radio was on, and I heard that guitar, and I was like, whoa, it's that TKK guitar, and she looked at me like I was crazy, and she told me this song was actually For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield. So it was probably Neil Young that actually played that lick that wound up in this TKK song, and I wonder if they paid him for the sample. Something tells me they didn't. But anyway, the funny bit is that this was the girl who later borrowed my TKK tape for years and years and ended up becoming a fan. So yeah, I corrupted her, maybe by listening to Buffalo Springfield at her house one night. Anyway, then we have the Cooler Than Jesus Electric Messiah mix. This is just an excuse to put Cooler Than Jesus on the album, I think. But pretty good version. Then on to my favorite track, which is Burning Dirt. So what is it about this track? A few things. I think one, it has this awesome spoken word intro that just builds up the tension. And two, it has this badass bass line and this weird sample in the rhythm that I just love. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's super funky. And three, Groovy gives a really good, outstanding vocal performance. And four, it's essentially a TKK reworking of a song that Groovy recorded with Ministry in 1998, which was called Tonight We Murder, which was the B-side to Ministry's huge hit, Stigmata. But where the Ministry version is harsh and minimalistic, TKK here turns it into a dance funk monster. So I kind of wonder if this was an old song that Groovy and Uncle Al did back when they were in Special Effect. I have no idea, but it is interesting to think about. And it is interesting to listen to the Ministry version and compare it to this version. I have no idea why they called it Burning Dirt here, especially since the chorus is really just him saying, "Tonight we murder," and so on. But, you know, there is that train graffiti to consider. Anyway, whatever. It's a great song. It has a really nice guitar solo at the end, too. Next is Confessions of a Knife Theme Part 2. This is another weird instrumental with movie samples. If I recall correctly, my tape that I made as a kid ended during this song. But later formats would have more tracks. This CD version that I have here has a version of their most infamous song, Do You Fear for Your Child, from their first album. This one is called Do You Fear the Inferno Express. It has this beginning that suggests it might be a live recording, but I kind of think that's not what happened. I think they tacked some live audio onto the front of a studio remix. I really can't tell. If it is an actual live version, it sounds really, really, really clear. But it's a nice groovy version of the song, and you know, its presence here makes this, like I said, into something of a best of album, even though it has a lot of new songs on it as well. Let's see. So I did buy a version of this album about 20 years ago when iTunes had just come out, and that version, I still have those copies of these tunes, and it's still giving me occasional digital rights management trouble. Thank you, Apple. But that collection had a few extra tracks that aren't on this CD. There were, I think there was a remix of Waiting for Mommy and also Ride the Mind Way. And then they added Confessions of a Knife Theme Part 3, which sounded like, you know, you took some other TKK track and just slowed it down by half. So it was really slow and really dirgy. If that's actually what they did, I don't know. I can't figure out what it is. Frankly, that track was just kind of too slow and boring for me to care, so I didn't really need it. But yeah, whichever format you get it in, plenty of songs on here, a lot of killers, so a lot of value for your money. And even if you don't have the earlier releases, you're getting some decent remixes of those songs, the best songs here, so you get some of their best work. Why do I love this? Obviously, the music just rocks. It's silly and fun. And this album might sound kind of formulaic and trite now, but it's only because so many other bands ripped off this magic recipe of Satanism, sex, satire, and industrial dance over the years, like I said. And I named a bunch of them. So in my mind, Confessions of a Knife is TKK's best album. They still had somewhat of an aggressive, harder edge here, and they hadn't yet gone over the top into ridiculous self-parody, and they would do that a year or so after this with their next LP, which was called Sexplosion. Although I do love their song Sex on Wheels, which I consider to be a classic that would have fit easily on Confessions of a Knife, and it's just a great song overall. But overall, that album, in my mind, seemed to move away from aggressive industrial in favor of this like sleazy disco sound, and I just didn't dig it as much. Um, but yeah, these early TKK songs are obviously a soundtrack of sorts to a lot of fun times for me and my friends. And, that whole world of strange memes that popped up around this was almost like a lifestyle for us for a while. And it was silly and creative and imaginative and fun, much like TKK themselves. And that's why I love this album. So, where are they now? Buzz and Groovy are still touring as TKK. They're still together. They've released 12 studio albums so far, many of which I never heard. I think I do have copies of Sexplosion and 13 Above the Night, but I didn't get much into either of those albums. As I said, I kind of lost my taste for where they were going after Confessions of a Knife. I did catch them on tour, though, in 2013, and weirdly enough, I heard that they were actually coming to my smallish town, and they were going to play a bar downtown, so there was really no reason not to go. And it wasn't even, I guess it was a bar, it was also sort of a restaurant, so it was kind of a strange venue, but I went down there with a couple of friends that night to check it out. It was 2012. I did a little fact checking, and it was actually 2012. Anyway, we went down to the place early, to get a bite to eat. And I'm just sitting there in the restaurant eating a pulled pork sandwich. The door opens nearby, and Groovy Man himself is sticking his head out to check out the crowd. And I think I pretty much did a spit take. I might have been the only one in the restaurant who saw or cared. Maybe he was just looking to get a sandwich. I have no idea. And we had to go upstairs to see the show, which was like a wider area with a stage at one end. And the stage was really tiny, and it couldn't have been more than, I'd say, 15 feet square. It was a really small stage. And I remember the opening band was called Left Spine Down. And honestly, they didn't leave much of an impression on me. I don't really remember their song so much, other than their lead singer kind of came across as a butthole. But anyway, they did their thing, whatever, and then TKK came on. And I think this was like a random weeknight, so the place was not super packed, and we found we could get just about as close as we wanted to get, which ended up being maybe about 20 feet back, which was far enough that Groovy couldn't sweat on us. But the amazing thing was that they had 7 people in the band at that time. They had Groovy and Buzz, there was a bassist, a guitarist, 2 backup singers, and then they had a drummer, and the drummer we recognized as Justin Bennett. I'm calling him out, or as he was known when he was in TKK as Justin Time, Thyme, get it? I'm calling him out just because we had seen him play with Skinny Puppy in 2008. And at the Skinny Puppy show, he was center stage with this huge, beautiful burgundy drum kit. And he was just rocking every song, and he really impressed us. With TKK, though, he was pressed into the back on what looked like the drum equivalent of a stand-up desk. So he had like a snare and a couple toms with a hi-hat, no kick drum. So compared to Skinny Puppy, he was pretty casual back there. But the show was really great, and we had a lot of fun. And afterwards, we were all just sort of hanging around in the upstairs bar, completely deaf. And then, the lights were on, and it was just basically a bar at that point. And there wasn't much of a backstage. There was just like a little space behind the stage that was literally behind that rear curtain. I think there was like just a couch and a table back there. And I know because my band had played there a few months earlier, and I was tripping out a bit that TKK was playing on the same stage that we played on, which, of course, why wouldn't they? But anyway, my friends and I briefly considered chatting up the band, and we did approach Justin, who I have to say was super cool, and he was a real gentleman. He fielded all of our drum nerd questions and never stopped tearing down the gear, but he couldn't have been more friendly to us. And then we had the moment of truth. Do we go for the rest of the band? And I'm sorry to say that we did not. I don't have a lot of regrets in life, but I do sort of regret not getting a big sweaty selfie with us and Groovy and Buzz and Jackie when I had that chance. I think, honestly, I think they just intimidated us. The thought of actually talking to them spooked us a bit. And for myself, they were Wax Trax legends. So I just had a hard time approaching them for some reason. But I do say us because that was the unanimous decision among my friends. I think we all felt it in some way. But anyway, yeah, regrets are a funny thing. It would be awesome to have that photo now, but alas. But anyway, yeah, seeing them live was definitely, for me, a bucket list item scratched. And I was happy to see them. And here in 2023, 11 years later, they're still on tour. So who knows? Maybe we'll see them again at some point in the future. But unfortunately for now, all of their dates seem to be on the West Coast. And I'm definitely not traveling over across the country to check them out. So here's hoping they come around again. So let's talk a bit about TKK's legacy. Obviously, this is a band that marketed in transgression, which would become very fashionable for other bands and people and individuals and groups over the following decades. I would argue that was all done by TKK and just in good fun. It was all tongue-in-cheek, and that's how we took it as kids. No one was taking this seriously. At its core, TKK was a great party band. They were not a band for committing ritual animal sacrifices or for any sort of serious religion, including devil worship, which after all is based on religion, right? Satanism, believe it or not, is just a really good way to get attention in the world of 1990 and even today. I mean, look at QAnon, right? So the fact is, TKK were probably doing more social good than bad. And for one thing, it was obvious to us that they embraced all sorts of sexual preferences. Groovy was definitely gay. Hell, Wax Trax itself was run by a gay couple. So the prevailing attitudes around these bands and their fans was one of acceptance, and it wasn't judgmental. And that's more than I can say for some entertainment we could have followed. TKK was silly and fun, but it also opened our minds a wee bit, especially when you take into consideration the larger industrial scene at the time. So TKK we saw as a band with gays and straights, with white folks and black folks and folks in between and men and women, and some we just weren't sure about, and it didn't matter. And it was something in that way like the melting pot that we as kids kept hearing about, this melting pot that the USA was supposed to be. So this band was not just for straight white dudes singing about how straight white dudes should have all the power. And we dug that aspect of TKK, even if we were largely straight and white, if not all dudes. And why? Again, because we weren't morons. And if you're halfway intelligent, you can understand that the world contains a lot of different people and a lot of different perspectives, and that giving people power is not a zero-sum game. It's good for many kinds of people to have a voice, especially those who've been historically marginalized, like women, like gays, and like people of color. And we understood that. And if you're listening to this and that bothers you, too freaking bad. I mean, get some critical perspective. You just listened to me talk about TKK for 40 minutes, and now you're bothered that I'm turning this into a woke lecture. I have news. TKK was woke before it was cool to be woke, and it is cool to be woke. So deal with that. Anyway, it's cool that a supposed joke band, a party band, could get someone thinking along these lines. So here's to TKK. May they ride the mine wave for many more years, and maybe someday I will get that picture with Groovy and Buzz and Jackie. I hope so, anyway. So there you have it, kids. My life with the Thrill Kill Cult. What an amazing band. They're still at it with many more studio albums for all of us to discover and love. So if you enjoyed this, stick around. I have plenty more 80s and 90s albums to talk about. This show is called Stronger Than Reason, and it's available on YouTube and as a podcast wherever you do that podcast thing. And if you like what you heard, please like and subscribe. I'm just a crazy old man with an opinion. I encourage you to leave yours as a comment. I encourage you to start your own show. Express yourself. It's very easy to do. Get out there and have an impact on your world, folks. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. And until next time, stay strong.